near future, we're scheduling a Judy Day.
Yep.
Good morning, all.
Good
Morning. We'd like to welcome everybody this morning. Glad you came, and if you're here now, when we come back to the area again, come visit us again. We're going to start out in your envelopes, number 144. And we have it on the board here. Oh, worship the King. Let us sing. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing His
Wonderful love, our Savior, Defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilion and splendor, and girded with praise. Thy fountain, O care, a tongue can recite. It breathes in the air, it shines in the light. It seems from the hills it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills the dew and the rain. Frail children of dust, and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust to fail. Thy mercies firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend. Bow with me, please. Dear God, our Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this Lord's Day that you've given to us, the opportunity to assemble together to study a portion of your word, and help it as we go through this study that we stay focused on the things that Jesse's prepared to pass on to us, and help us to be active participants in his lesson. Please be with the members of the congregation here that are still suffering with the health issues or may be traveling. Watch over and protect them and give them a measure of good health if it be your will. Be with this church and help us to grow in number and spiritually. Watch over and protect us and help us to be that light in the community. Forgive us for our shortcomings. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
It's the best decision that you ever made, putting Tom out here where you can keep an eye on him. No, at any rate, got some visitors among us. It's good to see y'all. And I'm sure that y'all probably have some out and moving around. Oh, there's Kelly. We can start now. She's here. Let me ask you a question. So have you ever had to do something like sharpen a knife? You know, you have to keep working on it to try to get the edge fine and smooth so that it's effective at doing what it's supposed to do, what it's designed to do, and what you hope it would do. Because, like, I know that I've learned that if you want to slice a tomato, you don't ever really sharp blade, or you just simply smash the tomato, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still working on that reinvention of myself that I've been telling you all about for about a year. And I'm really striving to develop this concept of simplicity, because I told you so many people argue about details, they get choked up on the little stuff, and they can't see the forest for the trees because they're looking at the little stuff. So as I'm trying to study this through, I discovered a concept called abstraction, which might be kind of technical, so I'm going to let Jesus explain it to you. So if you will, open up to Matthew 22 if you can, because we'll be working from that for a while this morning. But just to give you a definition real quick, the concept of abstraction is the process of taking away or removing characteristics from something in order to reduce it to basically a smaller set of essential characteristics. It's almost like when you diagram a sentence. You know, Bob ran home, but we might say that Bob ran hastily home because he was being chased by a coyote. But if you really want to get down to the core of the message is Bob ran home. The rest of it just tells you why. Okay? So somebody comes to Jesus here in Matthew chapter 22. If you'll scroll down there to verse 34. What happened was he had a conversation with the Sadducees, and he kind of silenced them because he kind of confounded them in their reasoning. So it says in verse 34 that when the Pharisees had heard that he put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Now what's interesting is the Pharisees and the Sadducees were somewhat of enemies. So you would think if Jesus got done silencing your enemies, you might be running over to them to figure out what Jesus is doing, because with his help, we can beat our enemies. But that's not what happened. They were disappointed. They weren't excited. So it says one of them, which was a lawyer, asking a question, tempting him. Not a sincere question. Not a, I would like to learn from the master-teacher situation. So, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus, knowing that that's a trap, he's going to answer it thoroughly and completely. But he says, you should love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second one is likened to it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. So he gave him a little bit more than he asked for, probably perceiving the trap that was laid for him, okay? But then Jesus says, on these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So how many Old Testament books do we have?
39.
39, okay. So there's a lot of stuff there. And Jesus distilled all of it. Think of all the stories. I don't care who you think about. If you're thinking about Gideon or Rahab or Daniel or what, Jesus says all of that hangs on what? These two principles. And what are they? To love God with all you've got, and to love your neighbor, right, as you love yourself. All of it comes down to that. What doesn't that, could you go back to the Old Testament? Could they have gone back to their scripture at that point and kind of itemize, wow, this concept belongs to, yes, the way I should treat God. This one belongs to, yes, how I should treat other people. I've heard people divide the Ten Commandments that way. The first ones, you should know the God before me, etc. They have to do with your relationship to God, and the rest of them, stealing and so forth, has to do with your relationship to your neighbor. So that other guy that thought he was clever comes to Jesus and says, but who is my neighbor? Okay, I gotta love my neighbor, but not that one, right? Because he's not like me. He makes me uncomfortable. But no, everybody. So, the law and the prophets then exist to do what? Teach us how to love God and to love our neighbor. But the love of our neighbor is qualified. How is it that we're supposed to love our neighbor? As we love ourselves. We see a little of that in the New Testament, that, right, the husband is supposed to love his wife, right, as his own body, in the same way that Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So we have parallels. And it's nice to have that comparison, because just like the guy that asked, well, who is my neighbor? What are the limits of my liability? Do I have to go out 5 miles, or is it 50 miles? Or is it the person on my side of the tracks, or the person on the other side of the tracks? It's all clarified. It's just all clarified. You don't have to ask a million questions anymore. It's as simple as love God with all you've got, and you love your neighbor in the way that you love yourself. And on those two things rests the entirety of the Old Testament. I would love to grow to that level of wisdom, because he put them to silence. It's not like they can even come back with another question. And Jesus often answered the question with another question. Remember one of the instances that happened? They came to him and said, what authority do you do these things? And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I'll answer your question, but first you answer one from me. The baptism of John, was it from God? Was it of heaven, or was it of men? They didn't even answer out loud. The Bible just tells us, right, that they reasoned in themselves, saying, well, if we would say of heaven, then Jesus is going to ask us, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of men, we fear the people because everybody perceived him to be a prophet. So they were in the trap. The people always trying to trap Jesus wind up in the trap. And I would love to not trap people. I don't want to trap people. But to make people see maybe the error within them by just being simple and clear and concise. Not arguing all the trees in the forest, but just to bring it down to the principle and just leave them with that. Because I've learned in my experience with some of them here that I used to really try to beat my thinking into my children, even if it was verbally, like, can't you get it, can't you get it, can't you get it? How many times do I have to tell you? And now I've learned that makes the child really, really, really uncomfortable. And so now what I usually do is I do a drop. I'll say what I have to say, and then to kind of take the pressure off, I'll not let it go, but I'll let it sink in. I'll let them think about it. I'll let them reflect on it before I keep going at it. And you consider Jesus' teaching, that's what he did, because he would drop really profound things. When everybody he fed the 5,000 and they showed up the next day hungry again, he's like, no, you're not here for that bread. You're here because your bellies were filled, right? And so what does he do? He says the most offensive thing. I mean, everybody laughed. What does he say? Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't have any part of me. Well, that was confusing. And so a great many of them left, and he looked at his core group and he says, you going to leave too? And he's like, well, who are we going to go to? You're the ones that has the words of life. So anyway, just some instances where Jesus, in obviously divine wisdom, uses the tools necessary to effectively teach the truth. Now, did he convert all these people? No. No, I remember reading one time, this probably been 20 years ago, those little ads that they place in the publications for people looking for preachers. And the criteria would astound you if you sat back and you thought about it the way that I was thinking about it at the time. You might look at it and say, well, yeah, man needs to be able to do this, man needs to be able to do that. It would be beneficial and effective if a man had this, a man had that. But you consider those criteria, somebody you're looking for to preach there, and ask yourself if Paul the Apostle or Jesus Christ met those criteria. Because they don't. If your requirement is that the guy has a family and this, that, and the other, you just lost Paul and you just lost Jesus. Now, could it be beneficial in some circumstances and instances that a preacher had those things? Probably so. But does it have any bearing whatsoever on his understanding of the truth or his ability to relate it? Probably not. But they're not going to be getting a job at location A, B, C, D, or E. So anyway, the law and the prophets exist to teach to love God and to love neighbor as yourself. And some of that just has to do with how we parse things out, the standards that we set, our expectations, and so forth. So I also came to the conclusion, because a lot of the arguments and disagreements among especially religious people is you get always back to this concept of law, which is what I talked to you about several months ago. I think it was November. Sin is a transgression of the law. For me, it's that simple. If you're accusing me of something, you have to cite the text that shows me my violation when I did wrong. It's that simple. It doesn't have to be a third-degree inference from something else that you duct tape together with something from over here to come up with new law. That doesn't work. And we know that doesn't work because the Pharisees tried that one on Jesus because, well, your disciples neglect the tradition of the fathers because they eat with unwashed hands. They tried to find fault with him in the thing with which there was no law. Can't do it. So I rest on the law. So then I start thinking, but we don't want to be legalistic, because legalistic is when you exalt the law beyond its practical purpose and function. So Jesus handled that for us too, okay? If you want to look, you can turn over to John chapter 7. John chapter 7, beginning in verse 22, is where the people are criticizing Jesus for doing a healing on the Sabbath day. Where does the power to heal come from? From God. Where did the law concerning the Sabbath come from? God. So God, I guess God's a hypocrite so that the Pharisees can be righteous. This is fundamentally the problem. And so he explains it to them in terms that, maybe they can understand here. But he says, okay, so the law of Moses says you circumcise on the 8th day. Lo and behold, you can't control what day your child is born. So sometimes the 8th day winds up being the Sabbath day. So now you've got to perform work on the Sabbath day. Now, either you're going to not do the circumcision on the 8th day and violate that law, or you're going to, do it and you're going to work on the Sabbath day and violate that law. Boy, what a probably, it's not a paradox, but conundrum that you place yourself in there, because you have exalted the law above its practical purpose. Now, how do we know that? I'm pretty sure that comes out in Matthew. We can go over there because it's a similar situation, but I underlined this one in green, which means it's the one that I wanted to use. So Matthew 12. And I've got verses 1 through 14 selected here. But you see, again, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn. And his disciples were hungry and began to pluck ears of corn and to eat. Boy, you got to imagine this. Like, y'all driven in the country, you've seen a cornfield or something somewhere, right? They're pretty big. There's a lot going on in a cornfield. What amazes me is that besides maybe these people and the birds, who else is going to be out in a cornfield on the Sabbath day, except for the Pharisees? And what are they doing out there if they're not eating corn on the Sabbath day, except trying to find somebody doing something wrong? Does that work for a Pharisee to find the stuff that other people are doing wrong? I think they're working on the Sabbath day. But nevertheless, verse 2, when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. Gotta love Jesus here, okay? But he said to them, have you not read? He didn't start his own argument. What are you doing out here on the Sabbath day? He didn't do that. And that's what we want to do as humans, right? So Jesus goes back and says, haven't you read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, not a cornfield, the house of God, okay? And it says that he ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, which means it was wrong, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priests. Now, if that's not sufficient, or have you not read the law, how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, what does it mean that the priests profane the Sabbath? They still have functions that they have to perform on the Sabbath day. But by these people's interpretation of Sabbath day, even the priests are violating the Sabbath day. So we're just going to have to kill the whole priesthood, I guess, because they're working on the Sabbath day. This is what happens when you take your little bitty line of reasoning from corn and you apply it consistently over everything to its end. You see how ridiculous it is. And sometimes we need to do that with our own thinking and with the thinking of other people. Let's take it from the little bitty thing that you've nitpicked and play it all the way out evenly, all the way till its end, and see what the fruit of it would be. And that's how you know. And that might be one of those things that helps us trim away all of that excess to get down to that core principle and that core teaching. He's not done, though. So, where was I? I made it to 7. But if you had known what this means, spend some time with this, okay? I've been on this before, and I'm still not completely done with it because it is really, it's a deep thing. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. So if you would go and learn what that means, you would have not condemned the guiltless. But, in principle, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath day. If all these examples I've given you didn't work, if this scripture reference I gave you just didn't work, remember one thing, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Well, that's something you can't argue with, right? So anyway, it says they departed thence, and he went into their synagogue. And behold, like he's still not done, right? And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And remember, all this comes out of this he healed on the Sabbath day, right? So here he is in the synagogue again, in the face of the people that just can't get it. God gave the law of the Sabbath. God gave the power to heal. You're calling God a hypocrite so that you can be righteous, okay? And so he heals the guy. But he does it. He asked him, saying, is it lawful? He even asked the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? That they might accuse him. So he's actually rubbing them on purpose this time, right? And he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have a sheep, and it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, and you won't go outside and lay your hands on it and pull it out of the pit? Any one of them is going to do that for a sheep. So his question is, again, for a principle, okay, how much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. So for all those other inconsistencies in their reasoning, if you can't understand it, it really comes down to Jesus loving his neighbor the way that God would have him love his neighbor, and having compassion and mercy on him rather than judgment and harshness and so forth. So wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. And I want to roll back to chapter 9 for a second too right here. Because this connects to the same idea. I mean, it's not the direct context, but it's the textual context. And so Matthew 9 verse 10, and it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they had special glasses, those guys. They said unto the disciples, why does your master eat with the publicans and sinners? Did he say, in Exodus, Moses said, thou shalt not eat with the publicans and the sinners? Was there a law? There was no law. But they found a fault where there was no law. We don't need to do that. So anyway, so Jesus heard it. He said unto them, they that be whole do not need a physician, but they that are sick. So here it is again, twice within 3 chapters, okay? But go ye and learn what this means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. For I'm not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Go and learn what this means. And I'm still trying to learn what that means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. I understand the thing in Samuel to obey is better than sacrifice, because what's the point? Sacrifice is for what? Your sins, your disobedience. So if you were, focused on the obedient part, there would be much, less need for sacrifice, if you will. It's sort of like get the priorities right. It's more about, working to be obedient and loving God and loving your neighbor than it is the sacrifice part on the other side. It's not that they're both wrong. Remember when Jesus told them, you pay your tithe of mint and cumin and all this, the little herbs, that cost you 12 cents, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and love, and so forth. Now, he didn't say that they should leave that tithe undone, but his point is that some things are kind of a bigger deal, that have a bigger impact. So do it all, but don't leave off those weightier matters, those more important things. Then one more story for you, kind of in this line of thinking. Luke chapter 10, 25 through 37, you have there the story of the Good Samaritan. I'm pretty sure most of y'all are really familiar with that story. But people came down the road, and pay attention there too, because I'm pretty sure it tells you a certain man. And I've learned, at least in my study and the way that I understand things, anytime that the Bible says a certain man, it's talking about somebody in particular. This was a real person. Like he's not a sower went forth to sow seed, because that's such a general principle. He was probably not talking about a certain farmer. But when he says a certain man or a certain priest or a certain somebody, this is some real life, the way that I understand it. So you have a story of Good Samaritan, and you know what happened. The guy got robbed, and he's left over there in the ditch, and down the road comes what? Like a priest, right? And he sees the guy. So he changes the side road. He jaywalked, okay? He crossed the road where it wasn't lawful to cross the road to get away from the guy where he might have responsibility. Now, priest had to be all ceremonially clean and stuff, right, to do his job, yes? So it might have been a violation of the law to go and defile himself in this situation, so he felt justified in not loving his neighbor. Likewise, so the priest came along. So he was a priest and a Levite, if I remember correctly, yes? And both of them did the same thing. Crossed the road and jaywalked, to get over here away from the guy, and proceeded to go on their way. But there was another guy, a class of people totally despised by the Jews, right? Which were the Samaritans, the little mixed breed people, the impures, right? And this guy comes along, and he picks the guy up, cleans up his wounds, drops him off somewhere where he could have some attention and some care. In the meantime, he said, when I come back through, I'll pay the rest of it. And so Jesus just asked this guy that asked him, who is my neighbor? And he says, which one, loved his neighbor? And the guy's like, well, I guess the one that had mercy on him. Don't say Samaritan, whatever you do, but yeah, the one that showed him mercy. So again, I think what we see there is some of this, don't want to violate the law to keep the law. Like if I'm going to work, if that's where the Levite and the priest were going, headed to the temple to work, I can be in a hurry on my way to work. I can be running behind on my way to work. What are the odds? And I know we live in this time now where everybody got a cell phone and they can call help when they're stranded on the side of the road and stuff. But my point, I guess, is that we can justify ourselves because we're preoccupied, because we're busy with something, we're on our way to do something important. We're on our way to church, so I gotta shake hands and stuff. I wouldn't want to get greasy changing the person's tire. This only happened to me like once in my life that I can remember. This one we lived right over here, just off the back road, 2 miles from here. And we were coming, it's a skinny little road, and somebody broke down, like in a bad spot too, the road. So all I could do, I guess they had a phone call, somebody about at least pushed their car or around out of the way a little bit so that they didn't get smashed by somebody flying through there like they're prone to do. But I was on my way to church. And so in that sense, I thought that's probably kind of what he's talking about in the Good Samaritan story. Somebody may not be bleeding out and dying. But is it more important to get to the church and hear the word, or to, in your life when you're not at church, do the word? Which is the weightier matter? Because we're supposed to do both. But is it a justifiable excuse if you're 10 minutes late to church because you stopped and you loved your neighbor? And I would argue yes. So I think that's practical application. Scott?
I was just going to bring up that there's a guy on YouTube that often tries to present himself as a homeless guy, and he changes situations, but he wants 50 cents or something like that.
Yeah.
And all these people go by him, and then the one person that gives him 50 cents, he gives them like $1,000 or
Yeah.
something like that. Hey, you
I've seen
get
that
back.
much.
And these guys that just walk past and look and see, and most of the time those people that walk past him are the ones that are, you can tell they're very well dressed. And the people that oftentimes help this guy,
Bougie.
yeah, exactly, it's just, they're not blessed with all that material wealth.
Yeah.
So,
So that's what struck me, is the concept of James says, be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. He didn't say not hearers, he just said not hearers only. Like if the rubber don't meet the road somewhere, we're probably not completely getting the job done. So funny to be the Pharisee and the Sadducee, where the rubber never meets the road, following Jesus around on the Sabbath day with his disciples, happened to be in the middle of a cornfield, because where else would the Pharisees hang out on the Sabbath day? There's just an irony in that to me. Right? They just had to constantly survey the guy from a distance with their really nice binoculars just to see if they couldn't find him doing something wrong. And I'm sorry, but that stuff exists in the church, and I'm not saying in this room, but it exists in the church, And they'll do this whole thing, well, am I my brother's keeper? Well, yeah, if you see your brother overtaken in a fault, right, you restore such a one, considering yourself, right, and meekness and fear, lest you also be tempted, right? This is Galatians. We know this stuff. But I don't think that reduces itself to follow them with binoculars 24/7, look at every post they post on the internet, follow them to work to be sure they didn't pass go and collect $200 when they went straight home because they might be up to no good. It's enough. But I have read articles and journals and everything else where people get all choked up on this little bitty stuff. And what did Jesus say? Don't judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgments in the direct context of the things we just talked about. But so many people, I saw Bob's car over there at that place. Maybe Bob was picking somebody up. Maybe Bob was loving his neighbor. Why you gotta automatically assume Bob's in there doing no-nos? It's not right. That is judging according to appearance. And if you really had the Bible pressed on you so much that you were so concerned about him, then if you've got a problem with your brother, get off of your couch and go talk to him about it. You think he's up to no good? Talk to him about it. Clear the air. Restore your relationship with a brother. And then feel that, I hope, because you realize that you judged according to appearance. Listen, if you see me stumbling, if I'm somewhere where I don't need to be, and you know me well enough that I should not be there, I would honestly expect the uncomfortable phone call, okay? Jesse, I'm pretty sure that I know you, and I'm pretty sure that you're not engaging in this stuff, but I just wanted to ask so that it's off my mind. And I would appreciate it. It would be awkward. It would be uncomfortable, but I would appreciate that, okay? I've had stuff like that happen before, when people thought maybe I was, into stuff, and it was uncomfortable. But at least we cleared the air, and we had the relationship kind of restored because we cleared the air. And there's a lot of instruction in the Bible about that as well. So here's my question, in all seriousness, okay? What would the New Testament look like to you if we abstracted it the same way that Jesus did the Old Testament? In other words, if the entire Old Testament is love God with our own mind and love your neighbor as yourself, and that is the Old Testament, what does the New Testament look like if we perform that function on it? Those two commands are still real, right? We still have those two, yes? I will submit to you, based on where I'm at in my study at this point in time, he added one. And John is the one who talks about it more than any of the rest of them. And I guess I jumped ahead of myself, but you can go to John 13. It's in 1 John, it's in 2 John. But if you were to go to John 13, and I've got 34 marked. It's obviously a larger context here, okay? So John 13:34, he says, "A new commandment I've given to you." Well, he's the one that distilled the old law down into two. Love God with all you got. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Rule number 3, a new commandment that I give to you, that you love one another. Oh, not as you love yourself. Not as he loved himself, but as I have loved you. So let that sink in for a minute. That's got to sink in for a minute. So I told you, man, the things I realized Jesus was crucified on the cross, and that was a massive sacrifice. Every minute, really, that we know of, from the time that he was studying in the temple at 12, okay, was devoted to the work of his Father. Every moment was literally a living sacrifice. And that's how we're supposed to present ourselves to God, right? A living sacrifice, your reasonable service. We're not asking too much of you here. My burden's light, my yoke is easy, my commandments are not grievous. You can do this. With the help of the Spirit and the brethren, you can do this. But I realize, and it comes out in John several times, that this is the new commandment that I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And that's a bigger love. That's bigger than loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Because we know that Jesus sacrificed himself. But if you remember my big story that I gave you about Mary and Bethany, and I connected all that together with Lazarus, and all the times that Jesus defended Mary and Bethany in front of other people, at Simon the leper Pharisee's house at that dinner where she broke the alabaster box of ointment, and Judas complained about the money that could have been collected from that. When she was sitting at his feet, and Martha was up, troubled about many things, trying to feed the crowds, and Lord, please tell my sister to get up and help me. And he said, no, because she's chosen the better part. Hey, service is good, taking care of people is good, but while I'm here right now, that's where you are. So not only was she offended that she didn't have any help, she was offended because Jesus said, you're not prioritizing right. So that Mary of Bethany is the one that he says, everywhere in the world that the gospel is preached, what this woman has done for me shall be told also.
I was going to say to love your neighbor as yourself. There are too many people now that don't love themselves.
That's it. That's a bad measure. That's a bad measure. He proved the measure, did he not?
He most certainly did.
And I understand fully, clearly, and completely that this instruction is given to Christians regarding other Christians, to his disciples regarding the other disciples. You love one another as I have loved you. You still love your neighbor as yourself, but there is a benefit to being a brother and sister, or what is the church? And so there's a larger kind of sacrifice due there. And I think we see that play out in the people that helped Paul. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the guy's name that popped in my head, but the one that was nigh unto death with sickness because he was trying to run around and do a lot of Paul's legwork for him. And he was asking people to pray for him so his health would be restored, lest he should have sorrow upon sorrow. So, there's different measures of sacrifice for the brotherhood than there are just the neighbor. So that's an improvement upon the two principles of the Old Testament. So I said all that to say that I'm trying to refocus myself, sharpen the blade, distill it down to the core principles. And I read an article this week, and it's rare that I just get smacked completely in the face with something. I like a whole new perspective that I never saw before. But this guy was talking about how the people that went to the preaching schools and entered the doctorate program, and he said over 50 years, it was just like 50 people. It's not a lot of people, I guess, that take it that high. That out of them, nearly all of them did their dissertation or whatever on something out of the epistles, some doctrinal issues or something like that. But very, very, very few touched the gospel category at all. And the ones that didn't touch the teaching and the ethics and the morality of Jesus. Yet we're told, be ye followers of me as I am of Christ. And guys, it blew me away because I am as guilty as snow is white when it comes to preaching the church. Structure, function, organization, law, order, rule. Have I neglected the weightier matters? Love, judgment, mercy. And I know I have. And I mean, I got knocked upside the head just this week. And I'm like, and so I started going back to my epistles, where we do all this structure, function, organization. And I made a list, guys. Every single book of the New Testament, I made it. But the primary example, probably the best one, would be like the book of Galatians, right out the front door. Okay? I marvel that you were so soon removed from the gospel of Christ into another, which is not another, but someone for the gospel of Christ. So the epistles go back to the gospel of Christ. Why don't I do that? Why don't we as a whole, church do that? And I'm not saying that some people don't get me wrong, but there's an imbalance, at least in my experience in my life and in myself, that we focus on those minutiae and we leave off the love God, love your neighbor, love one another as I love you. And for me, that's a huge problem. So I'm like, and I'm still kind of young, and I'm still like, this reinventing myself stuff has to come to an end, because I'm completely distraught with the mess that I feel like I've made in my life just by these things. But I want you to think about that.
So I think the reason that they do that is because it's easier to focus on order, it's easier to focus on rules, because they're right there, written for you. Whereas love is a concept that is just so complex and so complicated that how do you actually partake that, especially when you're supposed to love like Christ? Because as humans, just like Judy said, some of us, a lot of them, don't even love themselves, or there wouldn't be a need for counselors to help people learn to love themselves. So I think it's just easier.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also easier to be the Pharisees in the cornfield looking at the people in the cornfield eating too. Why are they in the cornfield? So it's all valid, and I'm just really obviously only targeting myself because I know myself, thoroughly and the stuff that I argue with myself. But it gave me a lot to think about. I mean, I underline stuff and I starred stuff. We've got 5 minutes left. I can't run you through all that. But even in Romans chapter 1, right? I'm going to declare the gospel to you at Rome also. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God and the salvation of us. So why did he write the book of Romans? The whole epistle is there. Why? Because the gospel of Christ. Galatians, why? Because you're removed from the gospel of Christ. And then I realized all the epistles go, if you take them out of context, you have legalism. That's what you have. That's what it is. Without the rest of it. Do we see our brother over taking in a fault and step in? Yes. Okay, do we want to worship God in spirit and truth? Yes, not at the expense of neglecting the weightier matters, the way that I'm reading it. Okay, and I know I get cranked up, but I'm mad at myself. I'm not mad at you all, okay? I'm mad at myself for coming to this point. And I'm glad I'm coming out of it, but I'm like, I hope I've got enough time left. You know how Paul felt? Persecuted the church of God, right? And we do that, maybe not with stoning people like Stephen, but in some sense, if we're so concerned about that congregation over here and what those people are doing, this is your house. This is your family. My function as a husband and father is in my house. I don't go to another dude's house and start playing husband and father. So we really need to focus on our own family. All the publications and literature and everything is what so-and-so over here said, and this is what I have to say about that. Show me that law or that example in the New Testament that Thessalonica was all crawled up in Corinth's business. Because they were not. The apostle was, but we don't have those anymore. He was an ambassador. We're a steward, if you like terminology like that. The role and the function is different. And I think for too long, it's a Pharisaical thing. I hate to say that because it's like, and so I'm reinventing myself not to neglect the law, but I'm stopping at law, guys. I told y'all that. That's probably December or something. I told y'all that. If somebody wants to bind something on me, they're going to have to do a little better than duct tape inferences, and they're going to have to give me law. Because I know that the word that he has spoken, the same shall judge me at the last day. Not with somebody who wrote a book 5, 4, 3, 2, or 100 years ago. They're not going to stand up between me and God on the day of judgment and say, well, you know, take it easy on Jesse over here because he's only doing what I wrote. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And we know that because James says, brethren, you know, there be not many masters knowing what? That we shall receive the greater condemnation. Boy, the times I should have kept my mouth shut. Because tongue's a small thing, but what a great fire that small thing kindles. And when you consider the divisions, Jesus' entire prayer, what is it? 3 chapters long or something? The prayer for unity, 15, 16, 17, and John, right? I neglected that for the minutiae, for the mint and the cumin and the anise and the herbs. That's what I know I have done. I got 3 minutes. We have a 3-minute warning. Anyway, and there were warnings against, I told you, everything going back to the gospel. Paul did give us the warnings about another gospel, or if anybody preaches into you another Jesus. That was the thing. Acts chapter 8, Philip and the eunuch. Philip came up to the chariot, and he asked the eunuch, do you understand what you're reading? And he says, well, how can I except some man guide me? You know, is this guy talking about himself or some other man? So Philip joined the chariot, and tell me what he did. Preached unto him Jesus. But I stood there, and I preached the church upside down, inside out, frontwards and backwards. I want to get back to preaching Jesus, not to the neglect of other issues. But that's the core of the matter. Love God, love the neighbor as you love yourself, love your one another as I have loved you. That's the recipe. And everything else, like you said, is hard to sometimes figure it out. Like Paul said in Romans chapter 7, right? Read that, because I spent a lot of time on that bike, okay? Paul's sitting there saying, oh, wretched man that I am, because he realized that the law, you know, concludes everybody under sin, and he's one of the everybody's that's concluded under sin. So he struggles. I think it's like 7:21 through 23 in there. But how to perform that which is good, I find not. Oh, he knew it up here. He excelled beyond the rest of the Pharisees, the ones even older than him. And I mean, he's an overachiever, Paul. Okay? But sometimes how the rubber will meet the road, how to perform that which is good, I find not. And I can tell you sometimes, I sit there and I should do something, but I don't know what to do. And then while I'm inside myself trying to find what to do, somebody else has already handled it, you know. And I'm like, thankful for that guy. But how did he know, or she know, to do that? Because how to perform that which is good, I find not. It's always been a real helpful. Chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8 in one bundle has always been very, very, very helpful to me in that sense. So there's a bunch of them, guys, that refer back to the importance of the gospel. Okay? 1 minute left. Hebrews chapter 4 talks about the ones that couldn't enter the promised land because of unbelief and everything. It says there in Hebrews 4, I think it's verse 9, that the gospel was preached to us as it was also to them. And sort of the point is that they were told what they were expected to do from God, but they did not do it, so they did not enter into his rest. The last one, and I mean, if you want to distill it down to a little bitty nugget, and you want to go to the epistles to do it and not the gospels, okay? 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And please remember, 1 Corinthians says those I of Apollos, I of Cephas, I of Christ people in chapter 1. And Paul says what? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? Nope, don't think so. So he says, I said nothing on you. Didn't want you to know anything except what? Christ crucified. Because he loved God enough to do it, and he loved me and you enough to do it. And if you would get rid of the rest of the mess and just stay on that and realize question, as much as everybody else did. Who are you to judge another man's servant? Before his own master he stands or falls, and he will be holding up because God is able to make him stand. So I've got to quit knocking people down and lifting people up. So that's where I'm at. The entire Bible, 3 principles. Love God, love you God, love your neighbor as yourself, and love one another as Jesus has loved you. I think that is 66 books and 3 verses. So I hope that might be helpful. Yes, sir.
I just want to throw, I've often wondered if a person's symptom of their Christian maturity, it's almost like before you become a Christian, everything's kind of okay because of the ignorance of the word, the truth. Then you become a Christian, and it seems like this first decade or two, whatever, you become that legalistic, like the Pharisees. And then as you become even more mature as a Christian, you tend to use more grace and mercy and true love the way that I think Christ has meant it. It's almost like, is that a cycle of being a Christian? It's an interesting thought.
You pulled a string out, but somewhere he says, "But you have not so learned Christ." And I think it's the whole point. It's the same idea of being little children. He gives you the sincere milk of the word, the simple stuff, right? And you come up in maturity. And we've got this whole idea that we should talk to somebody one time, they should hear the truth, they should be baptized, and should be done. And it's just simply wrong. And I realized that from gardening of all things. You can plant a radish and you can eat it in 6 weeks. If you want to plant a walnut tree and eat a walnut, you better start it 25 years ago, okay? Or you're going to be hungry. And listen, I sat in meetings, in mission meetings and stuff, where people were excited about India because they were baptizing 12,000 an hour. But those former commies over there in Russia and Ukraine, okay, you're dealing with 2 different soil types. You got atheists over here that you have to convince that there's a God at all. When you go to the Hindus that have already got 3,000 gods, convincing them that there's one more ain't all that hard. Convincing them that there's only one is. And that's the follow through. But the perception from the meeting table is, look at the return on that investment. Maybe, maybe not, because I've seen brothers check into it, because the names are long and hard to spell, that they baptize the same people multiple times. Keeps preachers busy, keeps them working.